Let's talk about all this with Julian Jessop, who's an independent economist. Julian, anything you've heard so far from Rachel Reeves or in the pre-announcements that suggest we are going to see actual growth in this country?
Well, as you say, I mean, a lot of this was trailed beforehand, so there have been no real surprises so far. To be positive about this, I think there is a welcome change of tone. So she is sort of talking about boosting growth rather than just banging on about the poor state of the public finances. And
that negative talk in the first few months and for those first few, and the budget, I mean, they really sort of killed off any hope for most people, didn't they?
Exactly. So if you look at what's happening in the United States, I think very few people really like Trump as a person, but they do like his policies and his positivity. And I think Rachel Reeves is trying to channel some of that today. So talk of a European Silicon Valley, for example, is a good example of that.
Yeah.
But there are some big problems here, and I sort of identified three already. One is that none of this is really new. You know, previous governments have been banging on about these things as well and haven't necessarily delivered.
Yeah. But they're saying they're changing the planning rules and pushing things through in with local objections. That's fundamentally what it's about. That's going to actually make it happen. I mean, it's unfortunate for people living locally, but yeah, we need it to happen.
Well, let's say if we take Heathrow as an example, I'm not sure if she's announced her approval of that yet.
No, not yet.
Many previous governments have done that, and it's still not happened. And of course, there's substantial opposition to that from within her own governing party. So that's
within her own cabinet. I mean, Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, has basically said no.
Yeah. And the second problem is that a lot of what she says, of course, contradicts other things the government is doing. So whether it looks at the increased regulation of the labour market or energy policy or her own tax increases, so the government is doing one thing with one hand and then doing another with the other. So there's sort of mixed signals here. And then the third problem is that, none of this is going to rescue growth in the short term.
Yeah.
Now, I'm pretty convinced the economy is already in recession, at least in terms of output per head. But most of the things she says are not going to boost growth for many years and potentially even decades.
I mean, we shouldn't want to try and put off MPs and chancellors and prime ministers from trying to boost growth in the future, because that's the reason why we haven't built reservoirs, we haven't built nuclear power stations, we haven't built HS2, we haven't built anything, no extra runways, we haven't done anything because no one does long-term thinking. I'd like a little bit of long-term thinking and investment and doing the right thing that you might not get the credit for, you might get criticised for, but actually everyone secretly knows you need to get on with. I'm all in favour of that, and I really want to support wherever that happens, because my God, whether I voted for this Labour government or not, and I think you've got a clue about that, we need this government to be able to do something right, because my God, people's livelihoods depend on it. It matters. But this is the thing. I don't think anyone believes this government, that Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves or anyone in the cabinet, or frankly virtually any Labour MP, has a clue how to grow the economy, has a clue how to run a business, has a clue how to boost growth in any meaningful way. They think you say words and then somehow it happens, and it doesn't matter if your actions don't really back it up. Like you say, let's have growth, but then you put up the cost of literally hiring a new employee, a few months ago. That whatever you said doesn't count for toffee if you're stopping people hiring.
Well, I think that's right. I'm not the first person to point out the lack of any real business experience in the cabinet, and I'll be particularly worried actually about Keir Starmer and Number 10. I think Rachel Reeves is clearly going to have big battles with her cabinet colleagues over the next few months and years. But is she really going to get support from the Prime Minister, who has, of course, no economics background, no economics expertise to back him up? And I think a lot of what she's proposing now will just get bogged down in internal party politics. To be more optimistic, though, at least the government does have a clear parliamentary majority.
Yeah.
So if it wants to push things through, it can, which hasn't necessarily been true of.
Well, yeah, I mean, sorry, Boris Johnson had a majority of 80, okay, working majority of around about 60 for a lot of the time. He could have pushed things through. Yeah, we had COVID, but we had enough years when stuff could have been happening. There's no excuse.
Yes, I mean, there's certainly no excuse for this government not to deliver on what it's promising. But I think you've also identified another problem, a sort of fundamental problem with their philosophy, which is on the one hand to boost the economy, to drive growth, but on the other to transfer even more money and power and responsibility from the private sector to the public sector, whether that's through higher taxes or more regulation in vital areas of the economy, or higher pay for public servants in areas which are not particularly productive.
Yeah,
so
indeed. But
there
also,
are lots of issues and problems there.
Yeah, but also this idea, something Candice Holdsworth touched on earlier, the government, the public sector think that they're the ones who can pick the winners. They'll whether it's any new version of clean energy or, or we decided to pick, heat pumps as the winner in the clean energy for heating our homes and things. They rarely get these things right. The market gets things right. We know that because that's how we've delivered massive prosperity across the Western world since industrialisation. The market delivers. There's no evidence that the public sector is very good at picking winners.
That's absolutely right. And I think one mistake that a lot of Labour politicians do is that they compare a sort of idealised world of super bright civil servants and politicians making decisions with some sort of model of the private sector that I don't recognise at all. I mean, the reality is the private sector is far from perfect, but it almost always delivers much better results than civil servants sitting in Whitehall or Westminster.
Yeah, absolutely. Just so you know, Rachel Reeves said that she's going to back plans by the Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham for the redevelopment of the Old Trafford. She has the plans to create new housing, commercial development, a new stadium, which could generate growth to the tune of £7 billion every year.
Could I just come in on that?
Yeah.
I think that's a good example of something that almost certainly would have happened anyway. I think it's inconceivable that a Conservative government wouldn't allow the redevelopment of the Old Trafford site. So to claim that as a win, I think is pushing your luck a little bit.
And there's going to be a lot of that going on. And again, a lot of the things we're going to be seeing are going to be things that are just necessities. They have to happen. Let's come back to the fundamental big elephant in the room. I mean, it's just like the trunk is kind of hitting my head, and it's like, well, I'm talking. And that is net zero. Forget, you've got Ed Miliband, who is a complete sort of religious zealot on this issue, as the Energy Secretary, who's opposed to things like Heathrow expansion and pretty much anything that would actually improve our economy. But the government has said repeatedly, the top priority is, green jobs and net zero and delivering net zero targets, but then also growth. Now, these things are mutually incompatible. There is no growth with a commitment to net zero. It is perfectly possible that under the laws that we currently have, that there'll be legal frankly, cases that could absolutely win by the eco-zealots under net zero laws to prevent a third runway at Heathrow because of anything that stops us achieving our climate goals is actually illegal, bizarrely, in this country. The government's, put this in place and Labour has supported it. Can they possibly deliver any reasonable level of growth whilst committed to net zero by 2050, but also, crucially, 95% clean, renewable energy, electricity by 2030?
Well, I've got nothing against the principle of net zero in itself, and a 2050 deadline I think is realistic. But you've identified actually the bigger problem, which is unrealistic targets for 2030. Now, there's some interesting analysis published earlier this week by an independent firm called Cornwall Insights that showed the government is way off track for hitting its 2030 targets.
What a surprise.
And they flagged up a concern that, if you set a target, you look like you're going to miss it, you panic. You do all sorts of sort of short-term things. You bung more money to your friends who've donated large amounts of money to the party in order to subsidise renewables, whatever else it might be. And you end up potentially actually driving up energy costs in the short term, coming up with solutions that actually in the longer term damage energy security. And that could be one of the ways all of this unravels. We have, the Chancellor trying to go for growth, but that running up against the targets that have been set by Miliband and others, that actually hold back growth and result in higher energy prices and less energy security than would otherwise have had.
Funny enough, companies are not going to be making their homes here if they can't afford the energy costs of running those businesses. Julian Jessop, independent economist, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on that.